The late afternoon sun bled gold across the dry plains of Red Hollow. In the back seat of an old 1972 Ford pickup, Laney Jo Mercer pressed her forehead against the window, her gaze locked on the winding road ahead. Twisted branches swayed in the wind like brittle bones. The silence inside the truck was broken only by the faint crackle of an old country song playing on the radio. Up front, Calder Royce gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles pale, not from tension, but from the quiet burden he carried without ever saying a word. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the house that morning. Laney could feel that something was wrong, even if no one had the courage to name it. Calder's jaw was set tight, and his weathered face stayed pointed forward. She clutched the faded backpack in her lap, where her mother's silver locket dangled from the zipper, cold like the goodbye that had never come. She didn't know where they were headed, only that Calder had said, "It's time you knew the truth." At the edge of town, by the rusted-out remains of Renford's gas and feed, Eldon Trace sat perched on a walker with tennis balls on the legs, squinting into the horizon. His beard was patchy, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes were sharp, the kind of sharp that could cut through lies if they came too close. He raised one brow when he saw Calder's truck slowing down. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered to himself, spitting a stream of tobacco at the dirt. "A Royce and a Mercer. This town don't forget blood that easy." Across the cracked road, Betsy Ellaway peeked through the lace curtain of her window. She hadn't seen Calder in over a decade, and seeing him now, older, heavier, haunted, made her heart rattle like a loose drawer. She turned quickly, calling down the hallway, "Rosie, come look. He's back." Rosalind Rosie Parnell, barely 16, came running barefoot, her red braid swinging like a whip behind her. She froze at the window. "That's her, ain't it?" she whispered. "That's Laney Jo." Meanwhile, down by the creek where the crows circled low, Harlan DeWitt and Otis Bramble stood ankle-deep in silence. Otis threw a flat stone across the water and watched it skip once before sinking. "He brought her back," he said without looking. Harlan, a man of few words and many regrets, simply nodded. He had to. It was never his story to keep. Red Hollow had gone quiet. And everyone knew, when Calder Royce returned with a Mercer in tow, it meant the past was done waiting. It was coming home. The pickup's tires crackled over gravel as Calder pulled into the lot of the old grain mill, long abandoned but still standing like a monument to secrets. Laney Jo stepped out cautiously, her boots crunching down on broken corn husks and dust. The wind was different here, colder, sharper, as if it knew something she didn't. Calder didn't say a word, just stared at the rusted double doors ahead. She followed his gaze, sensing that this was more than just a stop. It was a threshold. Inside the mill, the scent of dry rot and iron lingered. Shafts of light broke through the collapsed ceiling in thin, golden slices, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the stale air. Calder moved slowly, his hand tracing the wall as if retracing old memories. "You were born right here, Laney," he said at last, his voice gravelly and low. Laney's heart skipped. "What?" she breathed. "I thought—" He cut her off with a shake of his head. "You thought wrong. A lot was kept from you." Back in town, Sally Renford swept the steps of her porch like she did every morning, but her eyes weren't on the broom. They were on the road. She could feel something shifting, something pressing up from the past like roots under broken pavement. Sally had known Laney's mother, and she had known Calder when his back was straighter and his smile didn't look borrowed. She dropped the broom and walked inside, pulling a dusty tin box from beneath the floorboard. Inside, a photograph, a letter, and a name that still made her knees go weak. Rosie Parnell, meanwhile, sat on her porch rail, chewing a piece of licorice and swinging her legs. She hadn't stopped thinking about Laney Jo since that truck passed. "She looks like her," Rosie said aloud, though no one was there to hear. Her grandmother had warned her never to go near the Royce family, but Rosie never did like rules much. There was something magnetic in the unknown. She didn't just want to know Laney, she needed to. Down by the feed store, Clem Madison leaned against a post, one leg crossed over the other, watching the grain mill through a pair of binoculars. He was known in town as the quiet one, but Clem knew more than he let on. "She's here," he muttered, "and if Calder's bringing her to the mill, then everything's about to crack open." He lowered the binoculars slowly, then turned toward the payphone by the alley. Someone needed to be warned. Back at the mill, Laney stepped toward a boarded-up panel in the far corner. Some tug from the inside, made her reach out. Her fingers brushed the old wood. Calder stepped behind her. "That wall hides a lot," he said, "including the reason your mama left and never came back." Laney turned to him, her eyes glassy. "Tell me everything." And Calder, at last, was ready. Calder took a slow breath and sat down on an overturned crate, the wood groaning under his weight. He rubbed his face with both hands before speaking, as if trying to scrub off years of silence. "Your mama's name was Marlene. And this place," he looked around the dusty mill, "this place was where everything started and ended. She was 17 when she came here. Pregnant. Scared. And running from someone she swore would kill her if he ever found out." Laney's throat tightened. "Who?" she asked. Calder stared at the floor. "A man named Clem Madison." Outside, Clem hung up the payphone and lit a cigarette, his hand trembling ever so slightly. He watched the horizon where the grain mill stood like a tomb. He hadn't expected Calder to bring the girl back, not after all these years. And he certainly hadn't expected him to start talking. Clem had buried the past deep, along with the truth about what happened that night. But now the past was clawing its way back. And Clem knew, if Laney ever found the letters, everything would collapse. Back in town, Sally Renford stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at the face that had watched too many good people lie and too many bad ones walk free. She held the letter in her hand, the one Marlene had written days before disappearing. "Don't trust Clem," it read. "He knows about the mill. He knows about the baby." Sally bit her lip until it bled. She should have come forward back then. But fear had a way of making you small. Today, though, she felt something different. Shame. At the creek, Otis Bramble was skinning fish on a flat rock when Harlan DeWitt approached, quiet as always. Otis didn't look up. "You hear she's back?" Harlan nodded. Otis let out a low whistle. "Lord help us. Calder's diggin' up graves that never should have been touched." Harlan crouched beside him. "It ain't about Calder anymore," he said. "It's about that girl. And what she's gonna learn." Otis stared into the water. "What if it breaks her?" Harlan replied without blinking. "What if it sets her free?" Inside the mill, Laney pulled away the loose boards Calder had pointed out. Behind them, she found a tin box wrapped in a torn flannel shirt. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were photographs of a younger Marlene, pages torn from a journal, and an envelope addressed simply, "To my daughter." Her breath hitched as she held the letter. Calder looked at her, eyes shining. "That's her voice," he whispered. "She wanted you to hear it." Laney clutched the letter to her chest. She hadn't cried in years, but now the tears came easy, soft and slow like the wind through the broken rafters. She didn't yet know what the letter said. But somehow, she knew, it would change everything. Laney sat cross-legged on the cold mill floor, the letter trembling in her hands. The paper was soft with age, its edges yellowed, its ink faded but legible. She hesitated before unfolding it, her pulse pounding loud in her ears. Calder sat silently nearby, as if guarding a gate he never thought he'd reopen. With a breath that sounded more like a prayer, Laney opened the envelope and began to read. "My darling girl," it began. "If you're reading this, then I couldn't protect you the way I wanted. But there are things you need to know, About him, about me, about us. The words flowed like a current, dragging her deeper. Marlene wrote about meeting Clem Madison, about how he charmed her and then changed. He wasn't just cruel, the letter said. He was dangerous. I saw what he did to that girl from Hollow Point. And when I found out I was pregnant with you, I knew I had to run. Laney's breath caught. Clem wasn't just a name anymore. He was the shadow in every hallway of her childhood, even if she never knew his face. The thought made her skin crawl. Meanwhile, back in town, Clem stood in the back room of Madison Feed and Supply, the letter opener in his hand trembling as much as the cigarette between his lips. He could feel something in the air, a shift, like the earth tilting under his boots. He looked at a framed picture of Marlene on his shelf, taken before things turned dark. "You couldn't just stay gone, could you?" he muttered. Then he turned and opened a drawer, pulling out an old revolver. "If she reads that letter, I'll be done for." Rosalind Rosie Parnell had snuck away from her grandmother's porch and made her way toward the mill on foot, curiosity burning brighter than caution. Her gut told her that whatever was happening in that place wasn't just about family secrets, it was about justice. And maybe, just maybe, redemption. She had always felt drawn to Laney, even without knowing why. Now she was determined to find out the truth alongside her. Calder watched Laney as she finished the letter, her eyes hollow, her body still. When she finally looked up, her voice cracked. "All this time, you knew?" Calder nodded, pain etched deep in his features. "I swore to your mother I'd protect you. That meant protecting you from the truth, too." Laney stood slowly, fists clenched at her sides. "You were protecting him, not me." She stepped toward the door, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. "I need to see Sally Renford," she said. Calder didn't argue. He knew this moment was coming. As Laney crossed the threshold into the daylight, one thing was clear. The girl who entered the mill was not the same one who walked out. The old Renford house stood at the edge of town, wrapped in ivy and secrets. Its screen door creaked like a warning as Laney stepped onto the porch. Her boots left streaks of dust on the warped floorboards. Sally Renford was already there, standing just inside the door as if she'd been expecting her. Her gray hair was pulled back into a low bun, and her eyes, tired but sharp, met Laney's without hesitation. Neither of them spoke at first. The wind rustled through the trees like it was eavesdropping. Laney held up the letter with shaking hands. "She wrote your name. She trusted you." Sally nodded slowly, pushing the door open wider. "Come in, child." Inside, the house smelled of dried lavender and old wood. Every creak in the floor seemed to echo with history. Sally led her to the kitchen table, where a tin box already waited. "I kept this all these years," she said. "Told myself I was waiting for the right moment. Truth is, I was just scared." Laney sat, clutching her mother's letter as Sally opened the tin. Inside were more photographs, a hospital bracelet, and a folded birth certificate. "Your mother gave birth at the mill," Sally said. "Alone. I found her afterward. She made me promise I'd help her leave. Said Clem was watching everything. Said he'd never let her go if he knew you'd survived." Laney's mouth went dry. "But she did leave. And she left me with Calder." Sally looked away. "She didn't trust many people. But she trusted him with you." Meanwhile, down the street, Clem Madison was sitting alone in the back room of his store, drinking from a flask and watching the clock like it was ticking toward his own funeral. He had heard whispers. Laney had been seen at the Renford house. He ran a hand down his face, sweat glistening on his brow. "If she talks to Sally," he muttered, "it's over." And for the first time in a long while, Clem felt fear. Not the kind you show, but the kind that creeps beneath your skin and settles in your spine. Back at the house, Betsy Elloway stood at the edge of her porch with a pair of binoculars, watching Sally's window. She saw movement, two shadows talking inside. Betsy muttered to herself, "She's asking questions." She thought about going over there, but something told her it wasn't her place. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Red Hollow was about to split open down the middle. Sally reached across the table and placed a gentle hand over Laney's. "Your mama didn't die because she ran. She died because no one had the courage to stand beside her." Laney's eyes welled with tears. "Then maybe it's time someone finally did." And just like that, the quiet kitchen became the start of a storm. As twilight spread its lavender haze over Red Hollow, Laney Jo stepped off Sally's porch feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted. In her hand, she carried more than a folder of documents and faded photographs. She carried the weight of her mother's silence, now broken. Her boots thudded softly against the road as she made her way down Main Street. The town looked the same as it had every summer she'd spent here as a child, but now it pulsed with new meaning. Every rusted sign, every cracked sidewalk seemed to whisper a question. What else have they been hiding? At Madison Feed and Supply, Clem sat behind the counter, watching her through the storefront window. His heart jolted when he saw her coming. No hesitation in her stride, no confusion in her eyes. He reached under the counter, fingers brushing against the cool steel of his revolver. But he didn't pick it up. Not yet. Laney pushed the door open, and the old bell rang like the toll of judgment. The store was empty, except for them. Clem gave a half-smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for something?" he asked. Laney walked straight up to the counter and placed her mother's letter on the wood. "I know everything," she said quietly. "About the mill. About the night she left. About what you did." Clem's face twitched, just slightly. "You don't know what you think you know." She didn't blink. "She was 17. And you ruined her. Then you let this town forget her like she never mattered." Clem's smile faded. "That girl, your mother, was wild. She lied to everyone. Even herself." From across the street, Rosalind Rosie Parnell stood hidden behind a utility pole, eyes locked on the feed store. She had followed Laney from Sally's, sensing something big was about to unfold. She couldn't hear what was being said inside, but she could feel it. The kind of moment that turns whispers into headlines. She gripped her phone, recording just in case. Red Hollow had a short memory, but Rosie was about to make sure the truth stuck. Inside, Clem leaned in. "You think this town cares about ghosts? About what some girl said 20 years ago?" Laney didn't flinch. "They will." Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a copy of the birth certificate. Clem stared at it, then at her. "You're not bluffing," he said. Laney's voice was steady. "No. I'm cleaning house." As she turned and walked out, the door slammed behind her. Clem remained frozen, sweat trailing down his temple. For the first time in decades, he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold the walls up. And outside, beneath the first stars of evening, Laney Jo Mercer walked away, carrying truth like a weapon. That night, the town of Red Hollow didn't sleep easy. The sky hung heavy with clouds, and the cicadas quieted as if even nature held its breath. Betsy Ellaway stood at her bedroom window, the lights off, the curtains parted just enough to peer through. She had watched Laney leave the feed store with a fire in her step and Clem looking like a man 3 seconds from collapse. Betsy had seen that look before, on men who knew the past was no longer buried. She lit a cigarette with trembling fingers and exhaled slowly. "It's all coming back now," she muttered. "All of it." Across town, Laney sat alone in Calder's truck outside the diner. She hadn't spoken to him since she left Sally's. The engine was off, but the keys rested in her lap like a promise she wasn't ready to make. Inside the diner, Calder watched her through the window, unable to force his legs to move. He wanted to explain, to confess, to tell her he was only trying to protect her. But the truth was, he wasn't sure he'd done any of that. He'd kept her safe, but at what cost? Back at the Madison place, Clem sat in the dark, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and the revolver in the other. He stared at the gun like it was speaking to him, whispering every sin he'd tried to drink away. He had always counted on Red Hollow's silence. The town didn't like messy truths, it liked polite lies. But now Laney Jo was stirring things that should have stayed quiet. And worst of all, she had the nerve to carry her mother's face. At her kitchen table, Sally Renford held a landline phone to her ear. "Yes," she said, voice low but firm. "She knows. It's all coming out." A pause. "No, I'm not afraid of Clem Madison. Not any more." Her hand tightened around the cord. "She deserves to know the whole story. And so does this town." After hanging up, she looked down at a folder she'd pulled from beneath a loose floorboard. Inside were copies of complaints, never filed, letters, never mailed, and one name that no one had dared speak since Marlene vanished. Meanwhile, Otis Bramble met Harlan DeWitt behind the church, both men speaking in whispers. "Clem's cornered," Otis said. "A man like that, backed against a wall? He'll do something desperate." Harlan nodded, chewing the inside of his cheek. "Then maybe it's time we stop watching and start stepping in." Otis hesitated. "After all these years?" Harlan answered with steel in his voice. "Better late than never." As the clock neared midnight, the town sat on the edge of something sharp and irreversible. And in that stillness, Laney closed her eyes and whispered her mother's name, not as a question, but as a vow. The next morning, Red Hollow woke to a storm, not of thunder, but of whispers. The sun hadn't yet cleared the mist when Rosie Parnell uploaded the grainy footage she had recorded outside Madison Feed and Supply. In it, Laney's voice rang clear as glass. "You ruined her. And this town let you." Within an hour, it had spread through every front porch, every truck radio, every dusty iPhone in a cracked leather case. The video had no fancy title, just one word, truth. And that was enough to shake the roots of Red Hollow. Inside the sheriff's office, a young deputy named Emmett Clausen watched the video 3 times in silence. He was too young to remember Marlene Mercer, but he'd heard the stories in fragments, half-truths told in barber chairs and over hunting trips. Now he saw it plain. He turned to Sheriff Griggs and said, "We have to talk to Clem Madison." The sheriff didn't answer, just grabbed his keys and hat and walked out the door like a man headed toward the edge of something deep. At the diner, Calder sat across from Laney, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. "They'll come for him now," he said, eyes fixed on a crack in the table. Laney didn't look up. "Good." Calder swallowed hard. "But that means it's not over. It means people are going to start digging into all of it. Into you. Into your mama. Into me." Laney finally looked at him. "Let them. If we're gonna burn, then let's burn with the truth." Clem Madison hadn't slept. He'd sat in the same chair all night, watching the shadows shift around him. The revolver sat untouched on the table now, replaced by a stack of old receipts and a land deed bearing a name he thought he'd buried, Laney Jo Mercer. He picked up the paper and stared at it for a long time before tossing it into the fireplace. But the flames refused to rise. The past, it seemed, no longer burned. It lingered. At the church steps, Betsy Ellaway approached Sally Renford with a look of grim resolve. "You knew this was coming," Betsy said. Sally nodded. "And you knew it, too. You just didn't want to believe it." Betsy folded her arms. "He was your friend," Sally replied. "Then maybe I was a coward. But not any more." Together, they turned toward the town hall, where the silence of decades was about to break. And somewhere, Beneath the weight of new voices and old wounds, Laney stood outside the mill again, her mother's letter in one hand, and her own story beginning in the other. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a ghost in someone else's tragedy. She felt like the storm that had finally arrived. The town hall of Red Hollow had never been so full. Folding chairs scraped against wooden floors as locals packed the room, some curious, some nervous, and a few downright angry. Sheriff Griggs stood at the front, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He wasn't used to dealing with ghosts, much less living ones. At his side stood Deputy Emmett Clausen, holding a small folder that now felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It contained a copy of Marlene's letter, a birth certificate, and Rosie's viral footage. No one could pretend anymore. Not after this. Laney Jo Mercer sat in the second row, her fingers intertwined tightly in her lap. She wore her mother's old denim jacket, the one Sally had kept hidden for years. Around her, people shifted, whispered, stared. But she didn't flinch. Not when Clem Madison walked in. Not even when he looked at her like she was something to be erased. Clem didn't speak. He just walked to the front and stood beside the sheriff, the room thick with the heat of reckoning. Sally Renford stepped forward, her voice calm but fierce. "I was there the night Marlene gave birth. I was there when she swore that man," she pointed at Clem, "wouldn't rest until he buried the truth." A hush fell. Clem didn't deny it. He didn't even blink. Then Betsy Ellaway stood too. "We let it happen," she said. "We turned away. We told ourselves it wasn't our business. But silence was our business. And it cost that girl her life." Clem's voice finally cracked the silence. "She left. That's the truth." His eyes darted around the room, looking for allies that weren't there anymore. "She was unstable. You all know that." But the crowd didn't nod. They didn't look away. They waited. Laney stood slowly and faced him. "Even if that were true, it didn't give you the right to erase her. Or to raise me in a lie." Her voice didn't shake. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for her name." Calder stepped up beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "I should have told her the truth sooner," he said to the crowd. "I was a coward. But not anymore. She deserves her story back." Sheriff Griggs finally cleared his throat. "There will be an investigation. A real one. With everything laid bare. We owe that to Marlene. And to Laney." Clem Madison turned toward the door like a man who knew it would never open for him again. As the townsfolk began to murmur, some in shame, others in sorrow, Laney looked around the room. The lies had lived too long in the bones of Red Hollow. But now, finally, the walls were beginning to fall. And what came next would be something honest.